Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Caesar Rodney. Now, Caesar Rodney will be famous to you if you live in the state of Delaware. He's a favorite son of that state. Other than that, he's not really well known, although viewers of this channel might know one particular story about him. So I am going to go through his midnight ride very quickly. I know I've discussed it before. I'm sure I'll discuss it again. We'll go through it very quickly, but I did want to talk about Rodney's importance at other times and places in the Revolutionary history. So, as for his story, the night of July 1st, 1776, Caesar Rodney is a member of the Continental Congress, but he is back in Delaware. Suddenly, word arrives that they're going to vote for independence the next day. So Mr. Rodney gets on his horse and rides through the night in a thunderstorm, lightning flashing, thunder roaring, rain coming down, gets to Philadelphia 70 miles away as the sun is coming up. He walks in to the Pennsylvania State House just as the vote on independence is taking place. He walks in, they say Delaware, he says aye, and independence is unanimous, except for New York, who abstained, but that's not the point here. Caesar Rodney it wasn't necessary for all of the states to unanimously approve independence, but in a way it kind of was, because this solidarity needed to be demonstrated to not just Great Britain and not just to the rest of the world, but to people living in America, that we are going to make this happen. So Rodney's story is amazingly important, and even more amazing is that Rodney had already been suffering from cancer of the face at this point in his life and rode with a sash, always wore a green sash over his face to stop anyone from seeing the disfigurement, unfortunately. But it makes his story all the more impressive that he rode overnight in a thunderstorm, pouring rain, with essentially one eye. Now, I wanted to talk today about how Rodney got to this position. Caesar Rodney was born about George Washington's age, and he came from a very wealthy Delaware family. Not the wealthiest Delaware family, but his family did have a plantation with probably about 200 slaves on it, which indicates they had a lot of money. So, unfortunately, Rodney's parents died at a young age, and he was the oldest of all his siblings. Luckily for him, he's the only one who got a little bit of education, although I will say his brother Thomas did also participate heavily in the American founding. But he got a little bit of education, but went through the orphans' courts, was taken care of, fortunately did inherit a good amount of money and property, and then Rodney ends up he gets elected in his mid-20s as sheriff. And this starts him on a long career of public service. He serves as a sheriff for a few years. He serves as justice of the peace. He serves as a clerk for several different parts of the county. And eventually he gets elected to the Colonial Assembly. And this is where Rodney really starts to make his mark. Because while he's in the 1760s, it's the early 1760s, he's elected to the Colonial Assembly. And for the next 15 years, he starts talking more and more and more about what Britain is doing wrong. And what's interesting is he was from a segment of the wealthy were part of what was called the court party in Delaware, or the city party. And their opponents were generally in the county party. Now, really, because of his status in the community, Caesar Rodney should have been part of the court party, but he ended up siding more and more with the county party, talking trash about Great Britain, to the point where in 1765, he's one of the few delegates sent to New York for the Stamp Act Congress. Yes, Caesar Rodney, 11 years before his magical ride, was in New York serving at the Stamp Act Congress, which protested the Stamp Act successfully. That's why when 1774 rolls around and they have the First Continental Congress, well, Caesar Rodney is again sent to presumably successfully resolve that issue. Unfortunately, it doesn't go that way, and 2 years later we have him riding in on horseback like a white knight, trying to save the day and verifying independence for the United States. After this, Rodney, who again is getting more and more ill with the cancer that's in his face, is making him ill and slowing him down, but he is still elected as president of Delaware. Much like Pennsylvania, Delaware spent its first constitution elected a president instead of a governor. But essentially, he was one of the first governors of Delaware, and he spent 3 years in this position, overseeing not just operation of the government, but he was the chief commander-in-chief of the state militia. Granted, Delaware state militia didn't do a whole lot because, that's not fair to say. Delaware didn't have a lot of battles in Delaware. There were several battles off the coast of Delaware in the Continental Navy and the British Navy, but inside Delaware, not a whole lot of warring going on. But I shouldn't have said the militia didn't do anything, because they did go help the Continental Army and help their neighboring militias quite often. Additionally, Caesar Rodney spent those 3 years raising funds to help pay for the national war effort. Furthermore, while he's doing all this, many of the Delaware soldiers that joined the Continental Army suffered great losses during the Battle of Camden, and he helped recruit more men to join the Continental Army and replace this. He's corresponding with the Continental Congress the whole time. He's corresponding with other states, and he's corresponding directly with George Washington throughout the war. About closing in on the end of his 3rd year as governor, however, Rodney decides to resign due to ill health. He's also elected 2 more times to the Continental Congress, but because his health is declining so quickly, he doesn't go. Now, he does continue to go to the Colonial Assembly now, at that point, the State Assembly, and is even elected as its speaker for a good amount of time. It was kind of as a symbol of appreciation from the other founders who, by this point, everyone in Delaware who was still around came around. And I do want to mention that while he was governor, I almost overlooked this, he did use the militia to weed out loyalists, because like I said, there was a huge loyalist following in most states, but especially in Delaware and in Wilmington. And Caesar Rodney, one of the reasons there weren't a whole lot of battles in Delaware is Rodney helped arrest the loyalists and get them out of the state, which beforehand was called the Lower Counties. Delaware was kind of part of Pennsylvania during the colonial period and kind of its own thing. That's a whole other story. But as for Caesar Rodney, sadly, he does pass away in 1784, just after we finally get the ratified Treaty of Paris and America is independent. Rodney holds on long enough for that and then passes away. Although I will say, like I said, he has many family members important, including one of his kids, goes on to be an Attorney General of the United States. So that's the story of Caesar Rodney. I just want to take some time and expand a little bit on his whole life. His story I told at the beginning is very famous, but his life and the rest of his actions are also extraordinarily important, especially going to the Stamp Act Congress is one of the most underrated parts of the American Revolution, or at least underappreciated parts of the American Revolution. And his time as governor of Delaware, he really did help the war effort nationally, and his efforts on a national stage, so to speak, were ahead of their time, because again, this is before he dies 3 years before the Constitutional Convention. So he was a little ahead of his time looking at it as a national issue, and he rode all the way there to make sure Delaware voted unanimously with everyone else because it was a national issue, as opposed to New York, who abstained, awaiting further instructions from their home. No, Delaware would have been voting no, and that would not have been so cool. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like. If you're new here, definitely hit subscribe. I put out videos like this 4 or 5 days a week, 5 days a week. And I will be back with another founder for you on Monday.